In a previous video, I talked about having a discomfort with asking people for money, and that discomfort generally being caused by a person who has not yet become generous themselves, right? What I like to do is share with you a very personal story about how I learned to tithe. It didn't come easy. It took many years, and I have my wife to thank. I mean, when we got married back in 1995, my wife just assumed that anybody that made their living asking people for money would themselves, be a biblical tither of 10%, right? And of course, I wasn't. I was in my early mid-30s, and like most Catholics, I probably gave 1 or 2% of my income to the church and other charities, right? And I thought, well, I'm doing as well as the next guy, and that's just fine. Meanwhile, my wife, who had been working as a youth minister making $17,000 a year, gave away 10% off the top. And so when we got married, we decided early on that she would pay the bills, and at the end of the month, I would reconcile the checkbook to make sure that we both had a hand in the family finances, right? So after the first month of marriage, she had paid all the bills, and I went to reconcile the checkbook, and I realized that she had given away, several hundred dollars, maybe like $200, $300, $400 the first month of our marriage. And I was having a heart attack, and so I called her into my office. I said, honey, do you realize you gave away like $400 this month? And she looked at me, she goes, yeah, why? Wasn't that enough? I thought, what do you mean wasn't that enough? I said, what are you doing? You only made like $3,500 that month or something. She gave away like $400, which is more than 10%. And so she just said, well, we have to tithe, right? I go, no. So we got into this big long discussion about how much we should be giving away. And at the end of the discussion, I felt pretty good about the fact that we settled on, I think it was like 2.5%, right? But here's what happened. Once I went from like 1.5% or 2% to 2.5% or 3% or 4% over the course of many months or even a couple of years, what I discovered was that at every step along the way, I didn't miss the money, right? And finally we made it to 5% and 6%. And somewhere along the way, what was happening was, as I learned to be generous, thanks to my wife's prompting and the grace she was probably praying for me along the way, as I learned to be generous, what I did was I learned to trust the Lord. I learned to trust in God's providence, right? And the more that I learned to trust in God's providence, the more convinced I became that, things will take care of themselves next month. And they always did. I remember one time, my friend Jim called me from Dallas and said, hey, how's it going? And I said, Jim, I got to quit giving away money. He goes, what do you mean you got to quit giving away? I says, I give away money, and the Lord just keeps blessing me over and over again with just more and more work, right? Now, by saying that, I don't mean to imply that you have a contract with God and you give away X and He returns X plus Y. That is not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is that can happen, and it did happen on more than one occasion, but that's not the real fruits of true almsgiving. The real fruits of true almsgiving is the grace that comes with it. And what I find is, going back to my story with Stella, when I hit like 5%, I did not have the courage, frankly, I did not have the courage to take that final step and go all the way to 10%. But what I did have was a trust in the Lord and a trust in my wife, right? And so I took the checkbook, I handed it to Stella, and I said, here you go, take us all the way to a biblical tithe of 10%. It was kind of like, when you go to the doctor and you want to give blood, that's the right thing to do. And so you just roll up your sleeve and then stick out your arm and turn your head the other way. That's the way it happened between my wife and I, And she took us all the way to 10%. And when that happened, what I discovered was that that step of faith was rewarded with God, not in material terms, but in spiritual terms. And this is what I think Catholics, especially our Catholic priests, that they have to come to understand is that when a person becomes generous, and they do as the Lord asks of us, from Genesis all the way through the Bible, to do a biblical tithe of 10%, there is a grace that flows from that. And the grace that flows from that I've discovered in my own life and I've seen in other people's lives as well, is the grace, the spiritual gift of courage. The spiritual gift of courage. I never had courage the way I have it now until I started to tithe that 10%. And with that 10% tithe, again, there came a spiritual gift from God. And the spiritual gift that he gave to me was the gift of courage. Now think about where the church is at today and where we need to go tomorrow. What is the number one gift that our church needs desperately in the world today? The gift of courage. The gift of courage. Now think about that. For 20, 30 years, beginning with John Paul II, there's been talk about the new evangelization. What is needed for the new evangelization? What is the outpouring from the Holy Spirit, the gift that comes from the Holy Spirit that is desperately needed in order to have a new evangelization? That gift is the gift of courage. You're not going to go talk to your neighbor or your boss or somebody else about Christ and the church without a gift of courage, right? And so what I'm trying to say here is that our financial lives and our spiritual lives are intimately linked together. They're intimately linked together. If you have been given the grace to take that final step to become a biblical tither of 10% first fruits off the top, grace flows from that, the gift of courage. And that gift of courage is the gift that the church needs more now than ever if we are truly to become a church that once again understands that we need to be a church that evangelizes others.